June 12th, 1943. In the cold black waters of the North Atlantic, 200 miles west of the Azores, a Wolfpack gathered under moonless skies. 10 German submarines surfaced in staggered lines, their steel hulls glistening in the swells as they prepared their night approach. The commanders believed they owned these waters. For years, the darkness had been their ally. Night attacks had torn convoys apart, sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. Out here, in the mid-ocean gap, where land-based aircraft could not reach, the submarines felt invincible. Engines rumbled as they charged their batteries. Radiomen tapped coded messages to one another, coordinating the final attack run on a slow convoy far to the east. The Wolfpack moved with confidence. The night belonged to them, or so they thought. But their transmissions were not drifting into the void. On the escorts of a hunter-killer group led by the escort carrier Bogue, antennas twitched at every burst of German Morse. The Americans were not guessing where the Wolfpack might be. They were tracking them with a technology the Germans barely understood. High-frequency direction finding, HFDF. Each radio message drew a line on the plotting table, and where the lines crossed, the Americans saw the Wolfpack gathering before any lookout ever spotted a periscope. In the carrier's Combat Information Center, operators watched the picture form with growing clarity. They knew exactly where the submarines were, how they were forming, and what they intended to strike. Radar operators scanned the darkness, their scopes pulsing with echoes from the Atlantic. Aircraft crews stood ready in their Avengers and Wildcats, loaded with depth charges, rockets, and the new acoustic homing torpedo known as Fido. High above the ocean, the night concealed the Wolfpack. But in the red-lit rooms of the carrier, the Americans could already see them. This was the night the United States Navy learned to hunt the hunters. By the summer of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a brutal turning point. Germany's submarines had once roamed the ocean with near freedom, sinking millions of tons of merchant shipping, starving Britain of food, fuel, and ammunition. The Allied convoy system was improving, but it could not protect every route. Nor could destroyers chase Wolfpacks across thousands of miles. The Germans believed night and distance were their greatest shields. U-boats attacked on the surface under cover of darkness, moving among convoys like wolves among cattle. When daylight came, they disappeared beneath the waves and waited. Then the Allies changed the rules. New technologies arrived in rapid succession. Centimetric radar could see periscopes breaking the surface. HFDF could follow every radio transmission. Sonar grew clearer. Depth charges gained reliability. Aircraft carried more fuel, more weapons, and more specialized detection gear. And most transformative of all, the ocean received a new kind of warship, the escort carrier. Smaller than fleet carriers, but large enough to carry 2 or 3 dozen aircraft, these ships were built not for fleet battles, but for hunting submarines far from land. The carrier Bogue, followed by Card, Kor, Croatan, Block Island, and others, formed the backbone of hunter-killer groups. Their mission was simple and ruthless: roam the Atlantic, find Wolfpacks, and destroy them before they ever reached a convoy. Germany did not realize how vulnerable it had become. U-boat commanders believed that escort carriers were too slow, too few in number, and too fragile to dominate the mid-Atlantic. They believed that night would always protect them. They believed that the Allies still relied on guesswork. They believed that the Wolfpacks were still the predators. But by 1943, American intelligence and radar had pulled the curtain off the night. Convoy escort carriers no longer acted as shields. They had become lances. The Wolfpack approaching the Azores that night moved under deteriorating conditions. Rain squalls drifted over the line, carving dark curtains across the horizon. Whitecaps gleamed faintly in the gloom. The submarines cruised at varying speeds, trying to maintain formation while recharging batteries. Some commanders scanned the surface with binoculars. Others trusted their lookouts alone. On the bridge of U-507, the captain calculated the convoy's estimated speed and direction, confident that his pack would fall upon it before dawn. He did not know that his every transmission revealed his position. On the escort carrier Bogue, radar screens flickered with echoes from squalls and distant ships. HFDF operators plotted more bearing lines, each one pointing toward a submarine preparing for attack. The more the Wolfpack communicated, the clearer the Americans saw them. The long-range antennas aboard the destroyer escorts stretched like spider legs against the dark sky, catching every German whisper. Aircraft crews hurried to their planes, boots clanging across metal decks, the smell of salt and oil heavy in the air. Below deck, torpedoes and depth charges were checked and rechecked. Aviation fuel pumps hummed. Steam curled across the flight deck as the carrier turned into the wind. If the Wolfpack wanted a night attack, the Americans were ready to give them one. A single contact broke the surface before any aircraft launched. Radar aboard the destroyer George E. Badger picked up a faint pulse just beyond visual range. A submarine had surfaced to transmit a final report to headquarters. HFDF confirmed it instantly. The Americans now had an exact fix. Aboard the carrier, the ship's loudspeakers crackled to life. Pilots climbed into Avengers, loaded with depth charges. The carrier's deck crew hauled chocks away. Engines roared. The first aircraft launched into the darkness, wings cutting through spray as they climbed above the storm. The Germans continued their approach unaware. More submarines surfaced, more transmissions crackled through the air. The Wolfpack tightened around the projected convoy track. But instead of unsuspecting merchant ships, they were closing on a hunter-killer group already bearing down on them. One submarine maintained too high a speed and revealed a wake that caught the attention of a patrolling aircraft. The radar operator aboard the Avenger watched the return pulse grow stronger. He marked the target. The pilot throttled up and descended through the clouds. The submarine commander heard the plane before he saw it. A faint engine drone approached from behind the rain. He ordered a crash dive. Men scrambled to secure the bridge. Lookouts shouted. The submarine's bow angled downward to escape, but it was too late. The aircraft's pilot released a cluster of flares. The ocean exploded with light, turning night into blinding day. The submarine, caught on the surface, glowed like a target under the falling fire. Depth charges tumbled from the Avenger's wings as it swept overhead. They hit the water in a perfect pattern. The first explosion lifted the stern of the submarine. The second slammed the hull and shattered instruments inside compartments already flooding. Lights flickered and failed. Crewmen were thrown to the deck. The boat tilted violently and lost depth control. Seawater gushed in. The submarine breached the surface involuntarily, nose rising as if gasping for air. Another wave of depth charges followed. The pressure hull split. The Wolfpack's silence broke. Emergency signals burst over the radio, but each message revealed yet more positions. HFDF aboard Bogue and her escorts plotted new bearing lines. There were more submarines nearby. Many more. The Americans now saw the entire Wolfpack map as clearly as a chart on a table. Radar aboard the carrier tracked returns that flashed and vanished as U-boats attempted frantic dives. Another aircraft followed a second contact. A submarine attempted to slip away underwater. Sonobuoys splashed into the sea, forming an underwater net. The Avenger circled above, listening through the buoys as they transmitted faint propeller noises. The submarine tried to mask its sound by stopping engines. The pilot dropped a Fido-homing torpedo. It entered the water and began a slow, precise spiral, listening for the faintest rhythm of screws. When it heard them, it snapped toward the sound like an arrow. The submarine attempted a desperate turn. Inside the hull, men braced for impact. They heard the torpedo's whine rise. Then a brutal metallic crack echoed through steel plates as the weapon struck home. Another submarine died in silence. Back at the surface, the destroyers closed on a third contact. The U-boat tried to fight back, launching a torpedo aimed at the escort's propellers. But the escorts were already moving in fast, zigzagging under radar guidance. They dropped hedgehog patterns that detonated only on direct contact. A series of sharp blasts signaled another kill. The Wolfpack was collapsing. 20 minutes had passed since the first aircraft launched. The hunters had become the hunted. And the night that Germany believed it ruled had been stripped from them by radar beams, radio bearings, and the relentless precision of escort carriers. As the explosions faded across the waves, the radios aboard Bogue crackled again. More bearings, more transmissions, more submarines approaching, unaware their pack was dying in the dark. The crew of the carrier prepared for the next wave. The Americans were not finished. The Wolfpack still had no idea how close it was to annihilation, and the Atlantic itself seemed to wait in absolute stillness for the blow that was coming next. Dawn rose slowly over the North Atlantic, a pale gray light bleeding across the horizon and revealing the aftermath of the night's violence. The sea rolled in long, cold swells. Oil slicks spread across the surface like dark wings, broken by scattered debris and the faint silhouettes of men clinging to wreckage. The Wolfpack that had once surged confidently through these waters now lay shattered beneath the waves. Only the wind carried their memory. But to the Americans aboard the escort carrier Bogue, the battle was far from over. Sonar operators were already picking up new contacts. Every echo on the screen hinted at another submarine. Every faint pulse promised another kill. Far to the east, another hunter-killer group was moving into position. The escort carrier Guadalcanal, commanded by Captain Daniel Gallery, cut through the Atlantic swells with determination. Her flight deck crews moved with practiced urgency as aircraft were fueled, armed, and inspected for another day of relentless anti-submarine warfare. Guadalcanal had already earned a reputation for aggression. She was not a ship that waited for contact. She searched, hunted, and attacked with precision. Now she was approaching a new cluster of radio bearings that suggested something dangerous. A fresh Wolfpack moving west to intercept another convoy route. The German command, still convinced that coordinated attack lines could overwhelm Allied shipping, had ordered multiple submarines into the open ocean. They did not know how completely the Americans had rewritten the rules. Their radio transmissions, once the heart of Wolfpack tactics, now acted like beacons for the enemy. Each coded message, each burst of Morse, each attempt to coordinate was caught by HFDF operators aboard Guadalcanal's escorts. Bearing lines crisscrossed the plotting table. The picture became unmistakable. Another Wolfpack was forming. Another ambush was being prepared, and the Americans were already inside its shadow. The morning air over Guadalcanal carried the steady growl of aircraft engines warming on the deck. Pilots studied their mission boards, memorizing the vector lines assigned by the Combat Information Center. Avengers were loaded with depth charges and the lethal phyto-acoustic torpedoes. Wildcats were prepared for search runs and surface attacks. On the steel deck, bombs clanked as armorers secured them into racks. The ocean breeze brought the smell of oil and salt. The carrier turned into the wind. Then one by one, the aircraft roared down the deck and lifted into the sky. The Wolfpack moved beneath them, unaware. 3 submarines ran on the surface in loose formation, each keeping visual contact with the others. Their commanders believed the area was safe. The sea was calm, the clouds low, the lights still dim. They assumed no aircraft could find them in such conditions. They had no idea that radar aboard the American planes could see through mist and cloud with dispassionate clarity. High above, one Avenger pilot watched the radar screen on his instrument panel. A large return pulsed steadily, another pulsed nearby, then a third. 3 submarines moving together, an opportunity that almost never appeared in the fluid chaos of the Atlantic. He reported the contacts. The aircraft began descending. On the surface, the submarines continued their transit. Crewmen smoked cigarettes on the bridge. Some cleaned the deck guns. Others watched the horizon for escort carriers that could not be seen with the naked eye. The ocean around them seemed empty, quiet, harmless. Then the first aircraft broke through the clouds. A lookout aboard one submarine shouted a warning, but by the time the captain turned his head, the sky was already alive with motion. The Avenger swept overhead, dropping a string of flares that ignited the morning gloom into blinding white. The submarine dove for the depths, bow tilting downward as seawater crashed over the bridge, but the aircraft had already calculated its trajectory. Depth charges fell in a perfect cross pattern around the diving boat. The explosions hammered the hull, twisting bulkheads and rupturing oil lines. Inside, gauges shattered, pipes burst, and lights flickered out. Men were thrown across compartments as the submarine plunged deeper, its hull groaning under the pressure. But the charges had found their mark. Air hissed from ruptures. Water surged through torn seams. The boat angled upward against the captain's orders. Within moments, it breached the surface involuntarily, erupting from the depths like a dying creature. It never regained control. The second submarine attempted to flee westward at full power. The Avenger pilot banked hard to pursue. He deployed a ring of sonobuoys ahead of the submarine's projected dive path. The buoys bobbed in the water, their hydrophones listening with eerie calm. The submarine dove beneath them, engines rumbling as it tried to slip away, but the sound carried clearly through the underwater microphones. The pilot received the bearings and dropped a Fido torpedo into the sea. The weapon spiraled downward, its acoustic sensors listening for the pattern of submarine propellers. Once it locked on, it accelerated. Inside the German submarine, the crew heard the faint, rising whine. Propeller noise pulsed through the steel hull. Men froze as they recognized the sound. There was no defense, no countermeasure, no escape. The torpedo closed in from behind and struck the stern with a metallic crash. The explosion ripped apart the engine room. The submarine began to flood instantly. It drifted downward into the cold darkness, swallowed with barely a ripple. The third submarine made a desperate decision. Instead of diving, it remained on the surface and ordered its deck gun crew to action. The gun pivoted toward the incoming aircraft. Shells boomed across the water. But the Americans were already prepared. A flight of Wildcats dove from above, guns blazing. Tracer fire tore across the deck. Crewmen scattered, some thrown overboard. The submarine's conning tower erupted in sparks and steel. Damage spread rapidly. Flames licked across the upper deck. Still, the captain tried to dive. But the submarine's ballast tanks were punctured. It could not descend. As it began to list to port, a destroyer Escort surged in from the distance, driven by radar bearings and guided by radio vectors from the aircraft. The destroyer unleashed a barrage of depth charges in a circular pattern. Even as the submarine attempted to right itself, the ocean around it exploded in towering columns. The blast broke its spine. The boat rolled sideways and disappeared beneath the waves. In less than 20 minutes, 3 submarines were destroyed. The Wolfpack had been wiped out with a precision that left the surviving German commanders stunned. The ocean that had once been their hunting ground now seemed to have turned against them. For the Americans, it was another victory in a campaign defined not by chance, but by technology, coordination, and relentless pressure. But Guadalcanal's greatest moment was still to come. 2 days later, sonar operators aboard one of her destroyer escorts detected a submerged contact moving cautiously through their patrol area. The echoes were faint but consistent. A submarine was approaching, unaware it had stumbled into an area patrolled by aircraft and destroyers working seamlessly together. The ship turned toward the contact. Another destroyer joined the chase. Depth charges rained into the sea. The submarine maneuvered desperately, trying to evade the spreading pattern. Then, in a move both bold and dangerous, the captain ordered the submarine to surface and fight. The submarine burst from the water and immediately opened fire with its deck gun. The destroyers answered with their own guns. Shells tore across the sea. One destroyer escort fired a flare that illuminated the target. The submarine attempted to bring its forward weapons to bear, but a broadside from the American ship tore across its deck. The submarine's captain realized he could not win a surface battle. He ordered the boat to dive. But explosive damage had jammed the vents. The submarine hung half-submerged, neither fully afloat nor able to descend. It was trapped. Guadalcanal's commander seized the moment. Instead of destroying the crippled submarine outright, he ordered boarding teams to prepare. The Americans would attempt something almost unimaginable in modern naval warfare, the capture of an enemy submarine at sea. Small boats raced toward the damaged U-boat. Boarding teams climbed up its slanted deck, careful of potential booby traps. They found demolition charges set by the crew but failed to detonate. They disarmed them. They opened the hatches. The submarine was intact. And for the first time since the American Civil War, a foreign warship was captured on the high seas. The submarine was the U-515, a veteran of the Atlantic War. Now it belonged to the United States Navy. It took days to tow the prize back to Bermuda. Seas battered the hull. Lines snapped. The boarding parties repaired leaks and reinforced bulkheads. At one point, the submarine nearly sank from under them, but they held on. When Guadalcanal finally steamed into port with the captured submarine behind her, the victory reverberated through every naval command. Germany had lost not only a boat, but also codebooks, equipment, documents, and technology that helped the Allies understand the evolution of U-boat design. The Battle of the Atlantic was turning decisively. By late 1943 and into 1944, hunter-killer groups patrolled the ocean with increasing confidence. Escort carriers roamed far from convoys, striking wolfpacks before they ever reached their prey. German morale collapsed. Veteran commanders were gone. New recruits entered boats that rarely survived their first patrol. The ocean that had once belonged to the submarines now belonged to aircraft, radar beams, sonar pulses, and the haunting echoes of HF-DF bearings. The wolfpacks dwindled. Then, they died. In the end, the story was not about fleets meeting in grand battles. It was about machines in the night, radio signals caught from thousands of miles, and submarines hunted by enemies they could not see. It was about 20 minutes in the North Atlantic when a wolfpack discovered that the ocean no longer offered shelter and that the darkness it trusted had been stolen by invisible eyes. When the final U-boat slipped beneath the waves on that calm morning, it marked more than a kill. It marked the end of the era when submarines could rule the sea. The hunters had become prey, and the Atlantic belonged to the escort carriers now. And in the cold silence beneath those waves, the wrecks of the wolfpack still rest, a reminder of the night when the ocean itself turned against them.